Hello everyone. Last week we covered the philosophy of Emil Cioran, specifically that of his book, The Trouble with Being Born, a work of aphorism originally written in French from 1973. The book is taken from the latter half of Cioran's career, generally referred to as the, quote, French period, and takes on general themes ranging from ontology, hagiography, and the question of purpose. Since we've refreshed ourselves about the basics of the book, we return to chapter 7, where Cioran states what he wants from writing. Quote, "My mission is to suffer, for all those who suffer without knowing it. I must pay for them, expiate their unconsciousness. They are like to be ignorant of how unhappy they are." End quote. While this aphorism may not be proposed in the beginning of the book, as is typical with theses, this statement alone is visible throughout the book as, in the stead of many philosophers, Cioran attempts to draw the leader to his prose. This semi-maieutic process is characteristic of many aphorists, and the pessimists in particular, who use the process to drag the leader through the proverbial streets in an attempt to generate an understanding. For Cioran, the understanding is about suffering, about unhappiness. This example is one of the least obfuscated examples of messaging throughout Cioran's work, simply stating his intentions and setting them roughly halfway through the book, despite their ubiquitous appearance prior. Further into chapter 7, Cioran postulates that the more one has lived their life, the less it seems well lived. Looking to outside sources, especially within those of the great geniuses of the world, we see that even the most well-lived lives leave great room for deprivation. For instance, Leonardo, despite all of his achievement and genius, was known for having written the phrase, quote, "Tell me if anything at all was done," end quote, hundreds, if not thousands of times in mantra repetition in his notebooks. We further see this dispassion in love itself, what is supposed to be the height of passion, but what is actually a calumny, a dialectic between slanderer and slandered. We suppose that, through marriage, this union is made transcendent, something Cioran scoffs at with his characteristic writer's zeal. He makes further use of this zeal in his commentary about noise, the thing that unites all beings, something he considers a great argument for the mineral kingdom, in the sense that they are all silent. It is known for centuries prior to the invention of modern technology that silence is important for our social being. Lincoln, Eisenhower, and many other presidents were known to have retreats. Lincoln's retreat, the soldier's home, being a scant example of solitude in the Connecticut city it occupies in the modern day, as noted by tourists. If silence is so important for beings, then why do we produce such noise? This is the question in essence. Cioran then remarks on the beauty of mental simplicity, how, quote, idiots, used in a medical context, achieve neutral mental states, something a person of intellect cannot achieve without great pondering and rumination, as shown by the previous example of Leonardo. This is one of the reasons that Cioran strives for a creation beyond being, something that is capable of expressing itself without becoming nightmarish, as is characteristic of all that, quote, is. However, we run into an impasse with skepticism, leaving us with a curious set of questions and roughly zero answers. Cioran comments on fanaticism, something seemingly ubiquitous in this disquieted technological world, the thing that contributes to both the annihilation of conversation and silence, seeming opposites. Fanaticism is uniquely formed through system building, the idea that someone can encapsulate a theory of precisely, quote, everything, which is noted here to be the fiercest of all mental oppressors. We take a brief respite here to further discuss the mission of Cioran, who, as we discussed here, wants to awaken the ignorant, but envies them all at the same time. In a seeming conversation with himself, Cioran asks why such a simple equation as, quote, existence equals torment, could not be understood by those around him. He then thinks that this must be his unique sensations that lend him this viability of understanding the concept, wondering if he could ever pawn off this condition to another. The answer is resoundingly no, but Cioran still understands that in order to fully encapsulate the feelings that he feels, he must actually feel them, and that speech is too, quote, lightweight to communicate such ideas, an idea that will reappear throughout the latter chapters. Many of us wish for a cabin in the woods, a Walden of our own, but know that this is unreachable. Cioran postulates that this should be a right for all beings, to abandon all cause for relationship and to retreat into the woods, lost to the world. We rarely think of the dangers provided by seeing friends, but the anxiety of missing out, the anxiety of disconnection, cannot be overcome by anything less than a brute renunciation, the cabin in the woods. It is for this reason that Cioran intends that we all experience a renunciation of our own, experiencing total disconnection from both friends and enemies, generating a total disconnection from anxiety. It is only through this that one would be allowed to live a life that they should be promised as the, quote, overworked malefactors that we all are. Cioran begins chapter 8 with a statement about generational perception. The idea that each successive generation believes that it is, quote, the one. We have seen him proven right, with each generation prior to, quote, Gen Alpha appearing to have some kind of megalomaniacal fantasy, in which it is the protagonist of the game that is the world. It is for this reason that we should each only teach our incoming generations that there is virtually nothing to be expected from life. One should not shake their bowl for more porridge because, as we will see in the successive chapters, the porridge was never there, only yourself and your starvation. Cioran's commentary on history extends into the concept of revolution, something that he understands as a recurring theme throughout history, as something of which he is quite tired, although reassured through its necessity of routine. Cioran, as do many pessimists, reject the notion of historical progress, seeing token events as grand typologies that are each possessed and repossessed by certain revolutions of the historical clock. It is for this reason that it is gentle on the mind to believe that history is so necessarily repetitive, as exemplified by cultures the world over, but at the same time it makes for an incredibly boring story in the ultimate sense. Cioran's comments on aging are common throughout the book. This particular aphorism, commenting on rage and aging, discusses the frightening fact that faces all geriatrics in the world of industrial technology, that successive generations will always have it worse and become further proletarianized, every possession, every passion stripped away to become corporate property. If not for the pseudo-Marxian perspective of decline, then we simply see technology encroaching further upon nature, the right to reject it becoming less possible by the day. Everything leads to an ultimate alienation, which is something thoroughly recognized by Cioran. He now refers to Hesiod cycles, which are, as pointed out by figures such as Julius Evola, characteristically general of Indo-European cultures. However, Cioran wishes not to discuss the true nature of these cycles in the sense of their origin, but rather what their original describers would think of true modernity, for example, today. Cioran implicitly assumes that they would think inevitably of today's world, as would be correctly assumed, given they consider their own worlds to be within moral dark ages, a condition such of ours being simply dispossessed of the imagination. However, a certain moral axiom that has always retained its clear constitution over the years is the fact that when others fall, we seemingly always laugh, no matter our conditioning or upbringing, another example of the lack of vicissitude in the human condition over the short period of time we existed within, something Cioran ultimately calls nothing in Chapter 12. Finalizing the chapter, Cioran comments once again on the human distinction from the Creator, destruction, this time pointing to the subject of the sage, something that appears throughout the book. He notes that sages are passive, withdrawn destroyers, while the average person simply destroys by nature. Sages, like any manipulator, inspire others to do their work for them. In the chapter, Cioran approaches Hegel, claiming that Hegel's statement that man can only free himself by, quote, surrounding himself with a world created entirely by himself, is untrue. He postulates that precisely this has happened, and we have never been more bound to moral ignominy, referring specifically to decline in the modern era from the progression of so-called, quote, technologies of convenience. In this aphorism, Cioran discusses how we dig holes for ourselves, or, as shown in the visual, push unwieldy boulders up cliffs. At the apex of our blindness from these problems, we will be convinced of success, which is always when the rupture with the current reality occurs. A notable example being Louis Pasteur, whose disillusionment in taking a break led directly to the discovery of penicillin, a failure becoming marked as a success. Cioran begins Chapter 9 by simply stating that we pursue things out of torment, or at least a need for it. In fact, our very quest for salvation is a torment, albeit subtle and camouflaged. This can be portrayed well within the depiction of the hesychast, who seeks to remain still and in constant prayer, an image that Cioran will invoke throughout the rest of the work. The hesychast, in his seeking to become closer to God, essentially disconnects himself from his social being, thereby tormenting himself in an attempt to achieve an endless goal. Similarly to Schopenhauer, Cioran hints at, if not blatantly states, the futility of all ends. Something that completes all ends is torture. If they had a true purpose, something to really actualize, then they wouldn't be torture at all. Cioran then goes on to discuss Blaise Pascal and his pensées, explaining that every debate with man becomes dated and anachronistic, whereas every debate with God, the debate of the pensées, is much more memorable and worthwhile. This is a cloaked commentary on the lack of universality in the social experience, part of the reason we exhibit pain, randomness. Cioran comments multiple times in the latter half of the book on this theme of anarchy in our lives and the suffering it brings. Similarly to how ends are not by means fertile, admiration has no connection to respect, We may respect something or someone, but at the same time not admire it, and vice versa. This is typically the case with earthly beings. Only beings beyond time, such as God, command both respect and admiration. Cioran then pivots to how he is able to tolerate existence alongside others, stating that weariness provided by this hatred, which has brought him into compromise with his circumstance. Cioran speaks multiple times of a quote compromise with anxiety, and finding common ground with disorder, something shown here in the example of tolerance. Later he states that virtues are in fact faceless, impersonal, in contrast to vices, which provide themselves clear depictions, especially as one ages. Gerontology is a subtle fixation of Cioran, who makes subtle commentary upon aging multiple times in the latter half of the book, explaining how he tolerates simply those who have experienced the quote march of the years, and finally returning to the theory of quote word pulping in the last video. Cioran comments on the destruction of language, while also commenting uniquely on commentary itself later on. He states that when reading psychiatric documents, for instance, it is the patient that interests him, similarly to how it is never the commentator that interests him in a classic work. What it is this particular challenge of the destruction of syntax, Cioran asks its castigators to try living without it, to try living without structure, once again another allusion to the lack of structure, providing anarchy and turmoil, thereby suffering in one's life. At one point, humankind believed that everything was full of gods, or at least represented by them. We then progressed into monotheism, and later into a complete point of secularism and scientism, to which we may now proclaim that, quote, everything is emptied of gods, end quote. This is a statement echoed by Philipp Mainlande and Friedrich Nietzsche, both pictured here. The idea of the, quote, death of God comes from the concept of God as a social existence, something that, once societally abandoned, leads to its death. Social concepts come in and out of vogue all the time, so why would it not make sense that God, in the context of a social theory, may also pass away? Continuing in his scrapple with the great philosophers, Cioran makes a seeming jab at Immanuel Kant by describing what sounds quite similar to Kant's quote awakening. Cioran describes a situation in which he must list every annoyance, becoming so annoyed by the length of this list itself that he concludes that it must be, quote, annoyance in itself that is annoying him, something that can only be categorically grasped, as implied by the statement that it must cure plague victims with its philosophical indignation. Cioran seemingly rejects skepticism while seemingly endorsing it throughout the book, providing aphorisms both in promotion and refutation of it, another apparent paradox afforded by the work. Commenting on greatness, Cioran feels that men are prodded into it by a certain madness, a certain forgetting of the ultimate fact of death. The manic genius shapes his reality, soon beginning to shape the world with his machinations. We've seen world leaders forget their mortality, causing them to go on rampages and conquests. Cioran gives the example of Hitler in a different chapter, stating that he had forgotten his mortality by the end, affixed solely to the idea of victory. Returning to the concept of regretting what hasn't happened or what is truly anxiety, Cioran claims that supremacy of regret are the actions that we never put into reality and are sole inhabitants of our consciousness. As we see in another quote on screen, the mind atrophies in peace and thrives in angst, something made visible by the attention economy that is developed in modern technological society, something many people cannot let hold of. Cioran furthers his deterministic thesis by stating that we are, quote, defective robots, that in some sense we are awaiting reprogramming, something he wishes to never have happen. Because of our defects, we are ontologically bound to be failed beings or a form of failure. Cioran insists that we last, quote, in spite of our ailments, all of us being so diseased that the diseases cancel each other out, giving the effect of stability. Further on disease, he states that disease is something we can come into once we hear its name, once the doctor assigns it to us, and once we accept it as our new reality. Before that, the disease has less control, but after this unfortunate occurrence, it assumes its new place as the new inhabitant of your Cartesian theater. We essentially become our ailments when they strike us to the degree to which Cioran is referring, only escaping such a condition when new things cross out the old. Life, to Cioran, is spent disease to disease. A particularly poignant quote about language, Cioran makes further ironic commentary about the destruction of human language, something he has remarked as being the epitome of shame. Claiming we should adhere to a single language and deepen ourselves in its mastery at every chance, Cioran asserts that gossip in one's native tongue is better than the, quote, highest of conversation with the greatest thinker in a foreign one. A brilliant example of this being the incredibly unfruitful debate between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky, televised and recorded so the world could watch what was supposed to be, quote, intellectual conversation become blood sport. This is another example of Cioran's pessimism regarding language, or at least its ability to truly communicate the human condition, something he otherwise postulates upon in later sections of the work. In what seems to be an anti-technological admission, Cioran exclaims how man is the cancer of the earth, replacing everything faceless with a face, to borrow his analogy. We typically see nature as, quote, faceless, a folly of anthropocentrism, but a common one nonetheless. Cioran here is expressing what is truly a central theme of the book, that being the destruction of progress and the looming forces of technology. As referenced in the earlier, quote, cabin in the woods hypothetical, Cioran accepts a certain yearning for nature, an appeal to nature over man. This is a demonstration of the shrouded idea of antinatalism, which is more explicitly known in quotes such as, quote, not to be born is undoubtedly the best plan of all, unfortunately is within no one's reach, end quote. What appears to be a riff on the Jewish proverb that is echoed in the introduction to David Benatar's Better to Have Never Been. Continuing with the theme of birth, Cioran proclaims the Kabbalistic narrative that it is our prenatal existences that truly belong to us, as explained in a different aphorism. This is yet another demonstration of the inklings of antinatalism within the text, although it wasn't fully elaborated to the same extent as later thinkers. The idea of torment has been shown to be explicitly inseparable from being in earlier passages, as something Cioran says awakens the, quote, psychologist and experimenter in all of us. Going back to the previous narrative of self-torment, Cioran asserts that we simply pursue things out of torture, or else we would have no motivation to pursue them, following in line with the thesis of Schopenhauer on futility. As you may remember earlier, a quote was referenced concerning how conversation with the mature is a specific favorite of Cioran's, which is now shown on screen. Cioran asks those that he loves and cherishes to grow old, so that they may one day become valuable to dialogue with, something that is implied they are currently lacking, as is himself. Leading from this discussion on wisdom, Cioran brings back the archetype of the sage, explaining how sages known in their lifetime often become the least remembered and vice versa. For sagely figures, this does seem to be the case, especially with the case for the Orthodox saints that Cioran typically studied. Cioran says that he loved the lives of the desert hermits, of the early church fathers, as the hagiography is one of his writing passions. Earlier in the book, Cioran mentions paradise, but does so by a variety of names. However, this is the first time that he describes paradise in a normative sense, exclaiming that it should lack shadows, as light will assault people from all angles, and not an inch of darkness to be seen. It is for this reason that there can be no paradise, there can be no reality as long as there is no darkness, for it is the contrast with light that defines objects as being themselves. Cioran postulates about a zoologist who was studying gorillas, and taken aback by their sedentary lifestyle. Cioran insists that this is the case for most creatures, that it is only humans who seek to experience chaos in their daily lives, as animals seek monotony, as when monotony breaks, the floodgates of fear open wide. Of course, fear is the cause of activity, which is why humans are so busy milling around in comparison to other creatures. Asking if we call sickness unjust, Cioran then asks if we are unwilling to do the same for being, as being is the true cause of suffering to begin with. Cioran implores us to speak of the, quote, injustice of existing, as yet another seemingly antinatalist sentiment from Cioran throughout the book, since sickness is only possible with being, just as being is only possible through suffering. Cioran asks if we're truly willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Nearing the end of the book, Cioran says that there is no position so false as having understood the meaning of life and then remaining alive. However, this is not a cause to commit suicide, but rather a call to education, a call to spread the message so others may not come into suffering. He comments as well on his childhood, stating that its, quote, crowned nature had to be paid for by the insomnia and other various illnesses that he began to experience around the age of 20. We often get this idea that we are receiving some kind of divine retribution, or that we are being punished in some ephemeral way for our thoughtless crime, such as being born. Cioran earlier states that it is our debates with God that become the most historically important, and man would have no greater calling to commune with God than to exclaim his rage, or to borrow from Cioran, quote, dagger words to God. To have opinions is inevitable, Cioran claims. However, convictions are less common. He wonders of the, quote, intellectual maladies that led the convicted person to their position, but then realizes it is himself, too, that is in such a position. Cioran, as a writer, was likely very committed and connected to the art of writing, but it would seem he began to develop a disdain for it later in life. He feels compromised by his belief in writing. He feels incomprehensible. Writing, as we've established, be it original or commentary, is an act futile as any other, making it a version of creation, just another brick in the wall. Nearing the end, Cioran states that nothing deserves to be undone just as much as it doesn't deserve to be done. We become detached from everything, quote, done. We slowly drift away from other beings, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. From advent to collapse, it is an observable fact of history. Cioran says that we should determine the truthfulness of a religion based upon how it treats its devil. The more eminent the accord afforded to him, the more concerned with truth. This is because it respects punishment, specifically divine punishment, the idea that you may receive retribution for your bad actions. A religion that lacks both respect for its creator and punisher have bad followers, who simply give in to all the vices of the world, essentially invalidating its form of asceticism. Finalizing our coverage of the chapter, we leave off with the quote, "The enormous good and the enormous harm I have drawn from my ruminations on the conditions of the dead." An allusion to the pain he has suffered just by simply thinking about the ghosts of the past. This is a very real thing for all of us who, when visiting the memory of a loved one, will feel harm done to us simply by the proverbial, quote, visit. This is simply because you are always left wanting by such an experience, as it is truly taunting oneself with a carrot on a stick, or in this case, a loved one past. Thank you for watching.